Go on to the next one. Now that's another picture drawn by Simon, which is kind of indicative of some of the other type of British Bigfoot reports. As you can see, kind of very thin waist and long, kind of like sinewy muscles. That's one of the things we find in a lot of these British Bigfoot reports, is that they seem kind of, as I said earlier, like agile, lithe, very fast running rather than lumbering creatures, shall we say. And on to the next one, please. And that's a place called Chartley Castle. Chartley Castle's probably about 20 miles from the Man-Monkey Bridge, but just in a different direction. I kind of lived there, Man-Monkey Bridge is there, and then Chartley Castle's there, so kind of like a triangle. Chartley Castle's been the site of a whole beacon, or it already is a beacon, I should say, for weird activity, and lots of high strangeness gone on there. Ghost sightings, as I'll come to in a minute, crop circles having been found in the direct vicinity of Chartley Castle. But in 1986, this was also the site of a strange Bigfoot-like encounter. And it was one that was the witness was actually driving home, again late at night, as is the case in many of these stories, and saw a giant, or not a giant, but just a large stag crossing the road. And of course, he just had to bring his car to a halt and just had to, had to let it cross the road and get out the way. As he did so, he was just getting ready to start the car up again, and he said this huge ape-like creature went bounding across the road after it, as if it was chasing it. And again, him and his wife were just sat there in the car, couldn't believe their eyes, and the guy said that as it bounded across the road, it kind of suddenly stopped, as if there was a realization that it was being watched, and it suddenly turned and glared at him. And again, this is a characteristic we get in a few of these British Bigfoot reports, that people either say the creature glared at them, or they get a feeling that it's kind of ominous in some respects, that it exudes this air of kind of doom and just very ominous feeling. And they just sat there, just petrified, didn't know what to do. Eventually, the creature just bounded off into the darkness of the fields. Now, that was 1986, in the summer of 86, and then in the summer of 2006, you can go to the next one, that crop circle appeared in exactly the same stretch where the Bigfoot creature was seen. If you imagine you just come straight down those tram lines towards the camera, the stretch of road is right here, and that's where the creature was seen. There was also evidence in, I think it was 1997, that there'd been some sort of ritualistic killing of animals in the area. There are a number of rabbits had been found dead, and weirdly, when I went out to investigate that crop circle, I found 5 large peacock feathers laid out in kind of like a pentagram symbol. So there's lots of strangeness going on in this particular area. And in the Man-Monkey book, there's a photograph of one of these peacock feathers, which I'm holding at the edge of the circle. Now, of course, peacocks wild peacocks aren't indigenous to the British Isles, certainly. So, we have again a situation where people are seeing these Bigfoot-like creatures in England, but it's not random or just a singular event. It seems to be tied in with other things. Now, again, what that means, if anything or nothing, is open to question and open to debate. And, there are as many people on this side of the argument as there are on that side. I think all we can kind of really do is just keep trying to gather evidence and just see where it takes us, where it leads us, and keep chronicling and reporting on the cases. And the next one. That looks just like a footpath with a bit of a dip down it. But it's actually a very ancient prehistoric site in England called Castle Ring. Castle Ring is an ancient, what's known in England as a hill fort, and it dates back to about 3000 BC. And basically at that particular time, ancient man would build these structures on high areas of ground where they could, prevent other tribes from coming into their area and engaging them in battle and taking over their land. So it was basically a kind of a watchtower, so to speak. It's actually the highest point in one particular area of Staffordshire, the county I grew up in, called the Cannock Chase. Now the Cannock Chase is this huge area of forest, probably about 5 miles away from where I was born, and kind of like the Bridgewater Triangle, that has this huge and lengthy history of weirdness attached to it. A lot of big cats seen on the Cannock Chase, again, black dogs, Bigfoot type creatures, even a lot of very, very strange werewolf type reports. And a lot of them seem to be focused upon the Castle Ring. Now there is evidence that the Castle Ring was also used by prehistoric man for ancient rites and rituals, and they used to pray to earth gods and things like that at that particular time. Now whether again that has any significance on why these creatures should be seen there, or is it purely coincidental? Again, you have as many people who think it's this as who think it's that. But I've spent a lot of time at the Castle Ring, and it's a spooky location at night, and I've seen some weird things and heard strange noises that it's difficult to kind of reconcile with normal animals of the type that are known to exist in England, like deer, foxes, and things like that. The things you'd expect in any normal forest. But the reports that have come out from this particular area of the Cannock Chase seem to fit very, very closely with the man monkey that was seen at the bridge. Fast-running creatures, flitting through the trees, making kind of very rapid grunting noises. And of course, it's actually not that far away from that particular bridge itself. So, we're looking at something where there's, in the particular county of Staffordshire, which is actually a very, very forested, green area, there's this heavy concentration of reports, and it's really only when you look at the reports as a whole you begin to see a pattern emerging of where there's large areas of forest in Staffordshire, we get the reports, and where, for example, there are open fields, we have reports of the creatures charging across the roads. And some people speculated, if these are flesh and blood animals, are they possibly going from forest to forest to basically feed and for protection. On the other hand, people have said, the British Isles simply doesn't have viable enough food to simply accommodate these types of creature. If you look at the daily requirements, for example, of a fully grown gorilla, how much food that has to ingest on a daily basis, the wilds of England, aren't really, you don't really parallel what you would find in, for example, the jungles of Africa or South America. So, where is it getting its food supply from to, feed a 6 to 7 foot tall lumbering ape type creature? That's one of the problems. Now people say, well, very often or occasionally, depending on the area, deer are found dead in England, farm animals are found slaughtered. And that does happen, there's no doubt that happens. Sometimes it's put down to big cats or wild dogs, but again, it doesn't seem to be on the scale that would be required to, I guess, feed, a colony of large ape-like creatures. And that's, again, one of the theories or reasons that has led some people to perceive these things as not being wholly flesh and blood in the way that we understand it. Now, there's another theory that's been put forward that is a very controversial theory, and a lot of it is dependent upon whether you accept that such things are possible. And this relates to something known as tulpas. A tulpa basically is something very, very, or was very, very prevalent in things like, for example, Tibetan law. The idea is that if you concentrate intensely and for a lengthy period of time on a particular image or a thing, you can kind of externalize that image and project it outwards to a point where it actually has some sort of semblance of life. It's kind of like giving birth, in simple terms, to a mind monster. The idea is if enough people believe in something, it can actually manifest and have like a quasi form of existence. And the theory is that forests, places like Loch Ness are spooky environments, and it's easy to imagine there could be strange things living there. And then if legends and tales begin to surface, do we actually create these things from our minds, and then they're externalized and people see them, not realizing that we're actually the creators of them. And again, as I said, it's a highly controversial theory, and I'm sure if we do the question and answer debate, Lauren will have much to say that kind of goes against that theory. But, you know, I think it's one of these things where it's important for us to debate the different ideas, the different scenarios, the different theories, because I think we're all on the same side in the sense that we're looking for the truth. We just want to know what's going on. I think for many people it's the interpretation or the conclusion we reach that sometimes differ. So those are sort of some of the various theories that exist as it relates to the so-called British Bigfoot in Britain. But I guess the British Bigfoot is actually only one of three so-called, what I call British man-beasts. The other two, one being werewolves, and the other one being very, very similar to the Mothman that Lauren talked about, which is known as the Owlman in Britain. So we could have the next slide. That's a place called the German Cemetery on the Cannock Chase, the large area of woods that I just mentioned. It's called the German Cemetery because when Britain was at war with the Germans in the First World War, a lot of prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, were actually brought to Britain and placed in one particular camp where there was an outbreak of influenza, and many of them died, and so they were all buried in one particular location. And then in the Second World War, when again a lot of German prisoners of war on British soil, a lot of those obviously died in captivity, and they were all buried in one particular cemetery, which is this one, the German cemetery. So all those graves there are actually German soldiers who died on British soil. But the cemetery itself, like a lot of cemeteries all around the world, has strange tales attached to it, and most of them seem to centre upon ghost stories. And as you might guess from the fact that it has a long military history or connection, a lot of the stories of like spectral and ghostly German soldiers have been seen crossing the road or standing near the graves, the sort of typical things you hear pretty much here, there and everywhere. But in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been an increase of cryptozoological creatures having been seen near the cemetery. Again, big cats, a few Bigfoot type reports, and at least 2 or 3 ghostly black dog reports. But in the summer of 2006, it was like all hell broke loose in the town of Cannock and the surrounding areas, when a lot of reports began to surface around the cemetery of what you could quite literally term as werewolves. These were described by the witnesses as being upright, human-looking in terms of, you know, arms, leg, torso, etc. And I guess in some respects looking like the Bigfoot-type creatures, but having a snout like a German Shepherd and pointed ears. Now, there were probably 7 or 8 independent reports along these lines of people seeing these creatures. I took that picture like that for a particular reason. Most of the reports were of creatures actually seen standing with their heads above that hedge or somewhere towards the tree line. They never actually kind of ventured directly into the cemetery, but it was almost as if they were, when people would see them, it was as if they were being watched in the same way that they were watching the werewolf. People got a kind of a funny feeling that something was watching them from behind. They'd turn round and they'd see this weird wolf-like creature just kind of staring at them somewhat menacingly in some cases. Now, I spoke with a guy named Jim Broadhurst, who was one of the witnesses, and he told me how him and his wife had been walking through the Cannock Chase woods one day, a nice sunny day. They'd been walking through the woods with their dog, and they'd seen this creature that they thought was just a very large wolf. Now, again, there shouldn't be any wild wolves in the British Isles at all. Although there are rumours about private collections having been released and things like that, or escapees. But he said they saw this creature that looked like a wolf, but much, much bigger, walking on all fours. And as it saw them, they said it suddenly reared up onto its hind legs, which of course, no normal wolf can do. And they said it kept them in sight at all times and backed away slowly in the trees until it was gone. So I looked into these cases and actually spent a night or two out in the woods, and during this entire same period, I was fortunate enough, I was back in England at the same time when this wave kicked off, and so went out there on a Wednesday night and then on a Thursday night and just sort of staked the woods out to see if I'd see anything, and didn't, unfortunately, which, would be, I guess, maybe too much to ask to actually go out there and see the thing you're looking for at the time. And But, you know, this is the sort of thing we have to do if we're going to stand a chance of even understanding or finding these creatures. But again, you know, the thing I find intriguing isn't so much just the reports of the animals or the creatures or however you want to define them. It's the locations. You know, it's locations near ancient castles, prehistoric burial grounds and prehistoric mounds, cemeteries, you know, places that you would imagine these creatures would be seen at random, but bridges, crossroads, ancient waterways, and that's something that, not just in Britain, but if you look at a lot of reports of weirdness around the world, you get these typical aspects surfacing in many, many stories. So the werewolf ones, though, are sort of very, very strange. The interesting thing about those is I've not yet come across one single case in Britain where the witnesses didn't feel fear, like a sense of fear and a sense of dread. That happened in every single case I've looked into where the witness felt they had like a sense of fear and panic coming on, that they didn't understand why it was happening, as if the creature was almost making it happen, if you like. Not just the fact they were scared of seeing it, but it was almost like an overpowering fear. And that's something that was more prevalent to these werewolf reports than, say, big cats, where people were just amazed to see, you know, a big cat running across the road. If we go on to the next one. That's, I guess, the closest thing that Britain has to the Mothman, which is known as the Owlman. Now, that picture again was done by Simon Wyatt. As you can see, it's actually perched above an old church tower. Now, the truth of the story actually isn't quite as dramatic as that. That kind of gives it some sort of King Kong kind of atmosphere above the Empire State Building or something like that. The reality is that the Owlman was actually first seen in 1976 in a place called Mornan Woods in the county of Cornwall. And Mornan Woods is just an area of woodland, but the creature was seen adjacent to the church in the woods. Now, the witnesses, I mean, in one sense the story is problematic because the stories don't predate 1976. And I think, you know, Lauren made an important point when he said that although the traditional Mothman stories didn't begin until the mid-60s, you know, there are kind of, I guess, earlier cases that conceivably could fall into that category. It's just the name Mothman, for some people at least, suggested, you know, a difference between some of like the Thunderbird reports, when maybe the difference isn't as extreme as some people thought. But in Britain, there really wasn't any sort of, I guess, precedent for the Owlman. It just surfaced out of nowhere. And again, there are all sorts of theories for what the Owlman was. You know, there's a straightforward, it was just a straightforward hoax that then got out of hand and spread and just developed from there. A friend of mine mentioned earlier, John, who runs the Centre for Fortean Zoology, he spent years chasing the Owlman down. And he kind of takes the view that, yes, people were seeing something, but he's not entirely convinced it was a physical animal. He sort of takes the view that it was more paranormal or supernatural. But again, how we define what paranormal or supernatural means, you know, it's simplistic terms that people throw about, but we don't really know how to define those terms. But again, you had this creature with these seemingly red eyes, large wings, and many of the witnesses actually said that this creature kind of just rose into the air, not like a large bird, you know, struggling to get into the air or flapping its wings. It said it kind of just rose up almost like a helicopter. That was one of the strange aspects of this particular story. But John chased this story for years and wrote a book about it called The Owlman and Others, which is a good book if you want to learn about British Mothman type stories. Since the initial wave of sightings in 76, a few other reports have surfaced, but certainly not on the scale of the Mothman. And it's very much sort of like a localized mystery that, you know, unless you're really into cryptozoology, probably, you know, you wouldn't know about it outside the British Isles. And I think probably most people in Britain have never actually heard of the Owlman unless they're actually interested in the subject. And the next one, please. That's a place called Glastonbury Abbey in the town of Glastonbury in Somerset, England. Glastonbury is a very old town, a lot of history to it. It's the rumoured so-called burial place of King Arthur is Glastonbury Abbey, and there have been various attempts to try and verify that, but, you know, nothing's ever been proven conclusively one way or the other. But a number of years ago, I interviewed a chap named Colin Perks, and he claimed to have seen a strange winged man-like creature in Glastonbury. Now this was less like the Mothman, less like the Owlman, and more like you would describe like a traditional gargoyle, in the sense like a man-like figure with bat-like membrane-type wings. And he'd been driving home late at night, saw this creature, again just literally standing in the road, and just scared him to death, petrified him. He actually became quite obsessed with this story of the Glastonbury gargoyle, to where when myself, John and Richard, who was, as I mentioned, the zoological director of the centre, we went to meet him, and he was very, very kind of scared, worried about this particular encounter. He'd started to have strange dreams about this gargoyle, as if it was almost stalking him. And he said he woke up one particular night in the middle of the night, and the creature was in the bedroom, and he felt paralysed and couldn't move. And he felt it had kind of almost metaphorically got its claws into him, I suppose. And when we met him in the town of Glastonbury, he's very, very frightened and scared, and wanted advice as to what he should do. And of course, it's difficult to give someone advice about what they should do if they encounter a gargoyle. It's not the easiest thing to give advice on. But this is one of the sort of disturbing things that actually happens in some of these cases, that it can have a very adverse effect on the minds and the psyche of the person involved. And when I say became obsessed by it, I mean that's, I would say, almost literally to breaking point. He was, a very, very nervous person, and it was quite clear that he'd been affected by the incident itself. So we basically spent a couple of days with him, talking with him, and he sort of dropped out of the scene. And every now and again I get an email or a phone call from him, and he's still obsessed with it now, still digging into it and researching it, not seeing the thing again, but it's quite obvious that it's massively changed his entire life. He's become obsessed by this creature. So these are the sort of three categories of, as I call them, man beasts in Britain that we get: the Bigfoot, the werewolves, and the large winged creatures, man-like body with very large wings. As I said, various theories. I don't personally go with the idea that these are straightforward flesh and blood in the way we understand it. As I said, I think the locations, we have to look at that. We have to look at the way they appear and disappear, the food issue of whether or not there's a sufficient supply, and the fact that Britain's such a small country. Those are the cases. Those are my opinions and thoughts. That quite literally is the tip of the iceberg. There's probably another 60 or 70 British Bigfoot reports on file, some of which have been investigated quite extensively, including one in 2003 at a place called Bowlam Lake, which was one of these cases. It was heavily investigated and covered quite deeply by the media as well. Earlier reports that I can personally think of is round about 1100 AD, when there was a story of a so-called wild man of the woods, as they were known at the time, having been captured, and he was described as having long straggly hair and a beard and a hair-covered body. Periodic reports would surface 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and today we get a steady stream of reports pretty much covering the present day, not just people talking about incidents they were involved in, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I hope that's kind of given you a little bit of a background on a subject that, as I said at the beginning, doesn't really get much coverage, purely because it is so strange and I guess off the wall in many respects. So if anybody's got any questions or any observations based on the things I've discussed, I'll be quite happy to answer them. Thanks a lot.
Folks, how about a round of applause? Nick Redfern. Nick, I have to tell you, great job, both ends of the doubleheader. Outstanding speech last night on Men in Black. You guys missed it, but tonight, British Bigfoot, one more round of applause, please. a Monster Mash t-shirt, and a certificate of appreciation. Thank you so much. Pleasure having you in Boston. Thank you very much, Nick Redfern. Okay, 2-1 Red Sox in the fourth inning. I guess the home plate umpire was injured for 20 minutes. It's a freak show here and a freak show down in Tampa for the Red Sox Game 6 here.